everyone. Welcome to chapter 4. This chapter is on the nervous system. So honestly, this is one of my favorite chapters. I find it really interesting talking about how a lot of our nervous system works, some of the neurotransmitters, and some of the just aspects of how all of that comes together. So this chapter is really important too, because it kind of sets a foundation for understanding and just kind of refreshing some of this stuff if you have learned a lot of it from other classes before. But it's going to sort of set the groundwork for how we're going to discuss it in this class. So again, this chapter is on the nervous system. We're going to talk about some of the different aspects of how our body works. And then the next chapter is where we're going to start focusing more on how drugs interact with that. All right, let's get into it. So chapter 4 is the nervous system. So here we're really going to talk about how the nervous system itself works, but also how sort of drugs kind of play a role in this process. So we're going to talk about some different components of the nervous system. We're going to talk about the different types of nervous systems. So that'll make sense as we go through them, things like central or peripheral nervous systems. We're also going to talk about neurotransmitters. So this is kind of the key component here of how drugs interact with the nervous system through these neurotransmitter components. And then we're going to talk kind of through the life cycle of a neurotransmitter, kind of how it goes through the different processes of, just resting in the body to being activated, and then sort of its effect on these different neural components. And then we're going to talk about some examples of drug actions and how drugs actually kind of fit into this puzzle here. All right, so let's talk about some different components of the neural system first. So of course, we have to start off by talking about neurons, right? So neurons make up our nervous system, right? And these are comprised of a few different components. So we have a picture of a neuron here up on the screen, and we can see that it has some general kind of similarity structures to it to other neurons we may have seen in the past, right? So we have things like the cell body, that large area on the left-hand side with the nucleus in the center of it, right? From there, we see things like the dendrites coming out. Those are those shorter little orange like roots coming out of that cell body. Those are actually what's going to take in signals from other neurons and send it to that nucleus. Then we have the axon, that long sort of skinny part with the tubes on it that extends out to the right. That's the axon that's going to send the signal from this neuron out towards other neurons. And at the end of that, all the way on the right-hand side, we have what are called those axon terminals. So those are the little pieces that actually touch and connect to the other neurons' dendrites, and that's how the signal gets passed from one neuron to the next. So aside from neurons, we also have other types of cells in our nervous system called glia. So the glial cells are actually cells that are primarily there for many other reasons other than just sending signals back and forth. So they provide different things like they provide the firmness and the general structure to the brain. They help nutrients get into the system, eliminate waste. They also form the myelin. So you can see on that image of the neuron, you see the myelin sheath, those sort of like tubes that wrap around the axon. Those are helped to be formed by different glial cells, and those actually help that signal travel faster down that axon. Glial cells are also helpful in creating the blood-brain barrier. So this is an important component here in keeping out toxins from our brain, right? So it actually helps to filter out and only allow in certain chemicals that are able to pass through and get into the area of our brain that affect these neural cells. And of course, again, the glial is also useful in communicating with other glial cells, right? So they kind of work together to perform these other actions aside from sending these signals like neurons do. All right, so let's talk now about neurotransmission. So how sort of that information gets passed from one neuron to the next. So we already kind of went through how that signal travels from the cell body down the axon to the axon terminals, which connect to another cell's dendrites that then receive that information. But when we talk about this, it's important to keep in mind too, that as that signal goes through the neuron, inside of the neuron itself, it's an electrical signal. So there's this electrical component. You can kind of see on the right-hand side, this graph showing up here of how this voltage in the neuron actually changes to get to a point where it can actually fire, right? So we see here as we go through this chain of events that happens in order for the neuron itself to actually fire and send some signal. So we start off sort of at this resting potential, this sort of like neutral state where the neuron is not firing, right? So this happens because there's actually sort of an uneven distribution of ions in that neuron. We don't need to get too much into those details right now, but just know that sort of this resting state is called hyperpolarization. Then what happens is these ion channels actually open up, and we'll see some demonstrations later on of how this happens, where those ion channels will open up and actually allow those ions to move in and change the voltage within the cell. This is called depolarization. And you can see on the graph, it's as that line is sort of starting to go up towards the higher peak. And when it reaches a certain point called the all or none threshold, so either it reaches this point or it doesn't, it has to meet that point. It's either all or none. Then what happens is the neuron reaches what's called its action potential, and it's able to fire. So you can see as it hits that peak in the top, it's able to fire and send off a signal. And then once it does that, it has to repolarize and come down and sort of reset. And in this process, we get what's known as a refractory period, where it's actually so far down that it needs time to recover before it can fire again. And so we see sort of, again, this chain of events that repeats over and over every time a neuron is going to fire. And this is kind of the process that it goes to. And you can also see in this image some of those failed initiations. That's where maybe it starts, but it doesn't meet that all or none point, and so it doesn't actually fire. So the neuron doesn't have any level of strength to its firing. Either it fires at full force or it doesn't fire at all. Those are the only two options it has. All right, let's talk now about the central nervous system and the overall nervous system and the types that we have here, right? So we have the central nervous system and the parietal or the peripheral nervous system, central versus peripheral. And you can sort of see if we start in the top of this tree, we work down and it first splits into either the peripheral or the central nervous system, right? So some of the functions of the central nervous system right off the bat are, this is things like the brain and the spinal cord. So there's a lot of functions here, right? But generally it sort of is designed to integrate information, it's learning, memory, coordination, things like this that we think of a lot of the time that our brain is sort of responsible for. It's those big picture components. And then when we get into the peripheral nervous system, this breaks down into two general categories as well. So there are a few others, but we're only going to talk about these ones here because these are sort of the main ones that I like to focus on. So first we have the autonomic nervous system, or abbreviated as the ANS, right? And this itself actually breaks up into two different components. So this has both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system here. So typically the sympathetic branch is responsible for sort of that heightened sense of awareness or of sort of that heightened sense of activity, right? So we get things like the fight or flight response, increases in heart rate. These are things that tend to happen during that sympathetic nervous system response. On the other hand, our parasympathetic response is designed to sort of calm down our nervous system or reduce different things, helps to reduce or decrease our heart rate and sort of come back into a more calm state. So think of that as sort of the two different sides there. So sympathetic is sort of that increase in activation or awareness, parasympathetic as the calming or reduction in that. And then, of course, we have the somatic nervous system, which is a separate piece, again, part of the peripheral, but not part of the ANS. And this somatic nervous system is sort of the cells on the front lines, right? So they interact with the external environment. They help control a lot of our voluntary actions. things where we are actually in control, moving our limbs, things like that. They carry out motor or movement function of those peripheral nerves, right? Like, so the extremities of our body, things like that. All right, so next we're going to talk about some neurotransmitters. So these are the actual chemical pieces of the process in converting or sending signals from neuron to neuron. So I said before, actually, that when we send a signal in a neuron, it's an electrical signal. And that is true inside the neuron. But when one neuron sends a signal to another neuron, it actually can only communicate through chemical responses. So this chemical process, which connects the two neurons, uses what are called neurotransmitters to accomplish this goal. So you can kind of see in this image, actually, right off the bat, this is an example of the dendrites and the axon terminal of two different neurons. And you can see they don't actually touch each other, but instead they communicate through passing back and forth these neurotransmitters to send this chemical signal to each other. So one of the first ones we can talk about here is dopamine. So dopamine you may have heard of before, right? So this is oftentimes part of the reward center of our brain, right? Or so often results in a sense of reward or positive outcome when we get sort of dopamine response. We also have acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is often things that can help with like memory or blocking some different memory impairment. So we often see sometimes those with Alzheimer's disease have issues with acetylcholine here in this case. Norepinephrine is another neurotransmitter here we can talk about. So this tends to influence the level of our arousal and attentiveness to things. It can also play a role in how hungry we are, right? Or how much we want to intake different foods. Serotonin is another one that is oftentimes associated with reward or things like that. So oftentimes it has a role in things like impulsivity and aggression, sometimes depression, also food intake and weight control, and also things like alcohol use and just general sort of impulsiveness. Serotonin also, I'll just make a note here, can sometimes play a role in the actions of some psychedelic drugs as well. We'll talk more about that when we get to those specific drugs later on. GABA is a really interesting one. So GABA is actually an abbreviation, right, for gamma aminobutyric acid. So this is interesting in the sense that it actually works to kind of calm down our nervous system, right? So it's sort of one of the ways that we reduce activation when there's overactivation in our nervous system. So it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It reduces activation and inhibits that activation. GABA is also often found in alcohol, which is one of the reasons we see alcohol reduce our ability to perform functions or cause impairment. Glutamate is found in most of the regions of the brain, actually. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter, so sort of the opposite of GABA here. And so again, can sort of be helpful in exciting different neural pathways when they need to be excited. And then again, GABA reduces those neural pathways when they need to be reduced. We also have endocannabinoids. So this also is found fairly distributed throughout the brain. A lot of recent research has sort of looked into this. And this is also tied to things like marijuana and can play a role in this neurotransmitter process. We also have endorphins, again, throughout the brain. These are naturally occurring, similar. They have like a morphine-like effect. So they actually play a role in pain relief, as well as feelings of euphoria and other general functions. All right, next, let's talk about the life cycle of a neurotransmitter. So I gave you some examples of what each of those were, but now we're going to talk through kind of what the process looks like and what their cycle or their life cycle actually is. So step one is just that they are kind of existing, floating around in our bloodstream, right? In the brain. They're just generally circulating in the blood, available to be used. Step 2 is they actually get what's known as uptake, right? So they get taken up by cells to be then used as part of this communication process between neurons. Then we have what's called synthesis, right? So these are precursors and synthesized into neurotransmitters through the action of enzymes. So they actually get transferred into neurotransmitters through this synthesis process. And again, enzymes help to, undergo that process and actually change the molecular structure to then make them usable as neurotransmitters. We then have storage. So now that they're available to be used, they get stored in sort of these what are known as synaptic vesicles. You can see in that image on the right, there are those bubbles sort of in the top part. And they store them there in the axon terminal, ready to be released to send that signal to the next neuron. Then we have the release, right? So when they're ready to be used, when that nerve is ready to fire, it releases those neurotransmitters out into what's called the synapse. That's that empty space between the axon terminal and the dendrite that's receiving it on the other end. So there's this gap, this empty space, and they need to travel through that. And again, that's called the synapse. So they're released into the synapse and they float around and are then in step 6 used in binding, or they are bound to those receptor sites on the receiving dendrite of the next cell. So you can see sort of those little, almost like trees, the blue and green, they're shaped in a way that they accept those neurotransmitters from the synapse and use those to bind to those receptor sites. And that tells that receiving neuron, hey, okay, I'm receiving this signal. It's my turn to now determine if I'm going to fire or not. And then, of course, we have metabolism, and this just helps to break down those neurotransmitters back into sort of their, resting state to be put back out into sort of our bloodstream to be started, able to start the cycle over again. So that metabolism just kind of breaks them down back into their resting state. All right, let's talk about some examples now of drug actions and how this kind of works in practice, right? So here we have sort of what are known as both agonists and antagonists. So these are two different types of drug actions that sort of work as drugs are administered into this process, this life cycle of the neurotransmitter. So agonist or an agonist drug tends to mimic some neurotransmitter, right? So the actual chemical of the drug may mimic some neurotransmitter in the brain and sort of acts to increase the number of those neurotransmitter functions that are present. So it activates receptors just like the neurotransmitter would. And so some examples of this here are like if there are not enough neurotransmitters, but you ingest a drug that mimics those neurotransmitters, you can see an increased effect of what that naturally occurring drug may do. Then we have antagonist here, which act in a different way. So rather than mimicking the neurotransmitter to bind to those receptor sites and activate that response, they instead block the receptor sites. So they may sit inside those receptor sites, but they don't activate them. They just sit there to block out the ability for them to absorb other neurotransmitters that they may otherwise want to absorb. So again, antagonist acts to reduce those signals passing back and forth between the neurons. Agonist increases those signals, antagonist reduces those signals. So an example here too are things like antidepressants, right? So these may block receptors. So these may block reuptake, not receptors, block reuptake of things like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. So if they're not able to be, reuptook into the into the synaptic, into the axon terminal, then they can't be reused and they stay in that synapse, and they continue to bind over and over again and continue to fire more and more. So it increases the ability of this binding of these two different factors. All right, and that wraps up chapter 4. Again, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week. Next week, we are going to get into chapter 5, where we're going to spend more time discussing how these drugs actually interact with our nervous system.